Bom dia a todos. Good morning. Great to have you back today for the class that will be given by Waïl Hassan and Alberto, or as we call him, Alberto Mussa. Waïl Hassan is professor of comparative literature at the University of Illinois in the US. And Alberto Musa is a Brazilian novelist. He wrote, among several other books, the Enigma of Qaf. I'd also like to say that today we're going to use a bit of Portuguese in this class, especially during the Q&A and when Alberto Musa is going to speak, because although he knows English, he's not fluent. He's not used to teaching and well, to this kind of context. But this is perfect, fine, because after all, most of you are Portuguese speakers, and for sure we'll be able to adapt, accommodate, and welcome, which is the main thing, all different languages and familiarities. So, yeah, so have a wonderful class, and I'd like to invite Alberto Musa, Waïl Hassan, and afterwards Janima will coordinate the questions and answers. She's representing here the Grupo Tarjama, which is the translation group of studies at the University of São Paulo, coordinated by Safa Jubran. So thank you very much. Welcome to both of you. It's wonderful to have you here. Great class.
Hello.
Well, good evening to everyone. مساء الخير. أهلا بكم, and I'm very happy to be with you today to have this conversation with my great friend Alberto Musa, and also to talk to all of you. So I'm looking forward.
Hello, people.
Alberto, pode falar pouco?
Sim, não. Bom, para mim é um prazer estar aqui, espero corresponder, atender às expectativas. É um prazer muito grande, particularmente por falar também para alguns alunos palestinos, já que eu tenho uma origem remota, né? Meu bisavô, né, nasceu na cidade de Jaffa, né? Então era um palestino também. Então, e meu trisavô nasceu em Lida, né? Alud, né? E de onde vem o nome Mussa, né? O nome dele era Mussa. E então é um prazer especial.
Yeah, he of course he says he's very pleased to be with us today, and he mentions that he is the grandson of a Lebanese immigrant in Brazil whose family comes from Palestine, from Jaffa. So they're Lebanese, but of Palestinian origin, from Jaffa and Lud, and hence his last name Musa, of course, which is the Arabic, which is an Arabic name.
Falar alguma coisa? Não.
Bom, talvez você pode falar sobre o romance, como descobrir a língua árabe, as mu'allaqat, a tradução da mu'allaqat, a escrita do romance, tudo. Pode ser?
Bom, claro.
Eu traduzo? Ok.
Bom, vou falando aos pouquinhos e você, né, para não ficar um trecho muito longo para você lembrar.
Ok.
Eu, por hábito, né, por ser escritor, por gostar de literatura, sou, antes de qualquer coisa, um leitor, né, como costuma acontecer, eu acho que com a maioria de nós. E, em um determinado momento da minha vida, em torno dos 30 e poucos anos, eu comprei uma antologia de poesia árabe clássica, né, do tradutor René Hawan, né? É um livro em francês, que é uma língua que eu também consigo ler, mas não falo. E comecei a ler esse livro. Logo os primeiros poemas, né, traduzidos ali, não integralmente, mas excertos, né, eram justamente das mualakat, dos poemas suspensos.
Okay, so he's describing how he first came to the discovery of the mu'allaqat. I should say first that Alberto grew up in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, not knowing Arabic. In other words, at home they spoke Portuguese. So he knew he had a strong relationship with his grandfather, but he didn't really speak Arabic with him. And therefore he didn't come to Arabic, the Arabic language and Arabic literature until later in life, when he had a program for reading world literature. And then at some point he came across an anthology of pre-Islamic poetry that is that is in translation. And he read that. It was a French translation of pre-Islamic poetry. And that was his first encounter with the mu'allaqat.
Bom, e aí, a partir desse primeiro contato, eu fiquei fascinadíssimo, né, por esses poemas e comecei, né, pela Amazon, comprar uma série de traduções, né? Então, comprei traduções em espanhol, em inglês, principalmente. Havia muitas traduções. Eu tenho ainda esses livros todos comigo. E fiquei fascinado porque aí eu pude, inclusive, ler os textos integralmente, né? Pelo menos aquelas versões traduzidas integralmente. E acompanhar também as lendas que giravam em torno daqueles poetas que a que se atribuíam, né, os poemas. E foi a partir daí que eu senti uma espécie de saudade de não ter aprendido árabe com os meus avós, porque na minha família, meu pai, por exemplo, ele tinha uma resistência muito grande, ele proibia que os meus avós falassem árabe com os filhos, e os outros também, né, meus primos também, nenhum de nós teve contato com o árabe. Nós ouvíamos o árabe na conversa entre os avós e os tios, mas ninguém aprendeu. Então, a nossa geração, aliás, nem meu pai sabia árabe, né? Nem meus tios aprenderam árabe. Era uma língua que foi esquecida. Então, eu senti essa vontade de aprender, né? E aí, vamos lá, vamos passar essa fase. Aí eu continuo.
Okay. He says that at that point, after reading about the mu'allaqat and some perhaps sections of them that were translated into French, he became very curious. He wanted to read the poems in their entirety, so he began to acquire translations of pre-Islamic poetry and of the mu'allaqat in full. So he, after the French translation, he acquired translations in Spanish and translations into English. And of course, there are several different translations in English of the mu'allaqat. He acquired all of these on Amazon and began to read the poems in full. And he was fascinated, very much fascinated by the poetry, and not just by the poems themselves, but also by the worldview and the mythology that informed them, and the entire culture of pre-Islamic Arabia, out of which these poems emerged. So he began to read even more widely around the poetry, to read about pre-Islamic culture in general, and the history of Arabia, and so on. Now, at that point, once he has sort of began to acquire that knowledge, he began to regret the fact that he did not know Arabic and couldn't read these poems in the original. And the reason for that, as he says, is that he grew up at home. His father didn't know Arabic, and his father and his uncles, all of them, didn't know Arabic, and in fact had a certain resistance to the language. And that's an effect of being, of course, a minority in Brazil and surrounded by a society that at a certain period in time of course, did not welcome difference, didn't welcome, other, immigrants from other parts of the world outside of Europe. So as a result, Arabic was not spoken at home, and he grew up, as I mentioned earlier, speaking Portuguese with very strong interest in languages. He studied, and I'm adding here something that he didn't say, but I know that from my relationship with him, is that he studied West African languages and also native Brazilian languages. And in addition to, of course, French and Spanish and other languages, he can read a lot of languages. So he has that ability to learn languages and a fascination for the cultures and the mythologies and the literatures of those areas. And within that context, of course, that context and the interest in world literature in general, that he came to Arabic literature, and he began to want to read the al-mu'allaqat, especially in Arabic. And that's the point where he will probably start telling us about how he learned the language.
Bem, só para deixar até claro, de certa maneira, para explicar, porque talvez isso não seja uma coisa muito comum, né? Uma pessoa ler línguas e não falar. Mas existe uma razão. Eu estudei letras, né? Fiz a Faculdade de Letras da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, e ali eu me envolvi, né, bastante com o estudo de linguística, né? Apesar de entrar na faculdade por causa da literatura, porque eu sempre li desde muito pequeno, sempre tive uma relação natural de leitura com ficção, né, poesia e ficção também. Mas eu, na faculdade, a linguística me chamou muito a atenção, e eu passei a me interessar muito pela linguística teórica, né? E particularmente por línguas que não eram muito conhecidas, né? Então, estudei línguas africanas, mas, assim, o estudo linguístico de línguas, ele tem uma característica, que isso é que talvez seja o ponto importante para deixar bem claro como o processo funcionou, porque o que eu aprendo muito rapidamente é a gramática, como a língua funciona. Então, é uma habilidade, talvez, não sei, mas eu consigo aprender bem os processos, né, de formação de palavras, de sintaxe, né? E não me preocupo, isso é uma coisa que eu não tenho nenhuma preocupação de aprender o vocabulário, de memorizar um extenso vocabulário que me permita a comunicação. O que eu quero saber é quase que como ela funciona matematicamente, porque eu também tive uma formação prévia antes de entrar na Faculdade de Letras em matemática. Então, fiz o curso de matemática. Então, eu gosto do sistema, né? E eu aprendo isso com uma certa rapidez. Então, estudei o tupi antigo, uma língua indígena brasileira, línguas bantus da África, Swahili, que inclusive até, de certa maneira, tem uma ligação com o árabe, porque o vocabulário do Swahili vem muito do árabe, mas eu naquela época não tinha conhecimento, então não sabia nem distinguir exatamente que palavras eram de origem árabe ou não. Mas hoje eu sei que é uma quantidade absurda, quase 80% ou mais. Bem, então, assim, o meu estudo de árabe foi dessa maneira. Eu comprei numa livraria que importava livros no Rio de Janeiro, chamada Leonardo da Vinci, era muito famosa porque trazia livros estrangeiros, nós encomendávamos os livros demoravam a chegar, né? Era tudo, o pagamento tinha que ser feito de acordo com o câmbio do dólar, então era um esforço, na época, difícil de se conseguir, mas eu comprei uma gramática, agora eu esqueci os autores, são vários autores, uma gramática publicada pela Universidade de Cambridge, né, na Inglaterra, e em 45 lições. E eu fazia essas lições todos os fins de semana, desde a ortografia, aprender o alfabeto árabe, e fui evoluindo na leitura e tal, mas não usando áudio, porque a gramática não tinha áudio, então era só leitura. Naturalmente, o áudio viria com o professor, né, que estivesse usando aquela gramática ali em sala de aula. Mas então eu aprendi e fui até o final. Fiz as 45 lições dessa gramática, eram em 2 volumes, E a partir daí, então, eu tentei a primeira aventura de tentar traduzir as mu'allaqat para o português.
Okay, so he tells he begins by explaining his relationship with languages and the way he learns languages. I mean, even despite his tremendous interest in literature, when he went to college, he wanted to study linguistics because he was fascinated with language as a system and language as a science. Which is what the discipline of linguistics, of course, is concerned with, rather than literature per se. And in the study of linguistics, I mean, linguists have a special relationship with language, and in that the most important thing for him and for many linguists is understanding how a language functions as a system. So he has great facility with learning the grammar, the structure of a language, the morphology, the syntax, these aspects of language, rather than learning a lot of vocabulary. And he can, so he wasn't interested so much in learning a lot of words and being able to speak in the language, so much as he wanted to understand how each language functioned as a system and how he could read in that language. And it's from that perspective that he studied languages like the Bantu languages of West Africa, and also the Tupi languages of Western sort of the eastern coast of Brazil, and also even the Swahili language, which has a very strong relationship with Arabic, of course, but he studied Swahili before he began to learn Arabic. And later on learned that Swahili has about 80% of its vocabulary that is borrowed from Arabic. But in any case, I mean, this is how he came to the Arabic language, with that kind of linguistic background and training. And he likens that to, that interest in how language works as a system, he likens that to mathematics, the way mathematics also functions according to sort of basic principles, really. And he has a certain mathematical background. He also studied mathematics, or he had studied mathematics before he came to linguistics. So that's the kind of the unusual approach to language that he has, which has to do with his background in linguistics, rather than the kind of the more traditional, the more familiar way of learning languages, which is you learn one language at a time. You learn, some of the, you try to learn the grammar and then build the vocabulary and learn how to speak and all of that. That's not how he approaches languages. So it was with that kind of preparation, with that kind of training, that he decided to learn Arabic. So he acquired a textbook for Arabic language that was prepared, that was published by the University of Cambridge, that had 45 lessons, and he began to teach himself Arabic and to learn Arabic on his own. And he started with the first lesson, working only on that during the weekends. And and these lessons began from the very basics, just learning the alphabet, what the letters are and how to write them and so on, progressing all through 45 of them until by the end he could read Arabic.
Bem, eu acho que essa tentativa, né, claro, também foi feita com o apoio de um dicionário muito importante, que é o dicionário de árabe e espanhol, Federico Corriente, que acho que talvez até seja usado no Brasil, porque foi usado muito tempo antes dos primeiros dicionários, né, português-árabe serem lançados. E então, com essa ferramenta, eu fui tentando fazer. E apresentei um esboço de tradução para o professor João Batista Vargens, professor de árabe da Faculdade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, meu amigo pessoal também, né? E ele me incentivou a continuar. Então, eu traduzi primeiro a Mu'allaqat do Imru Qais, E depois eu fui aprimorando num processo que demorou 10 anos, né? Desde da compra da gramática, né, do árabe até a conclusão da tradução. Eu, durante o processo de tradução, é claro que aí algumas das palavras, né, que eu consultava o dicionário e aí eu reencontrava essa palavra adiante, eu, às vezes, já tinha na cabeça, mas mesmo assim fazia questão de verificar para ver se eu não estava cometendo nenhum erro. E eu cotejei, né, comparei as minhas traduções, eu fazia a tradução e comparava com o texto nas diversas traduções que eu tinha. Várias em inglês, algumas em francês, uma tradução em espanhol do próprio Federico Corriente, que era o autor do dicionário. E, com isso, eu fui aprimorando, porque muitas vezes eu descobria que eu tinha cometido um erro, ou descobria que o verso que eu traduzi de uma determinada forma era traduzido também de uma forma completamente diferente por todos os tradutores. Então, eu ficava até mais feliz e mais tranquilo, porque aí eu podia dar a minha versão, a minha interpretação do que eu tinha conseguido ler, conseguido captar, né, da imagem. E, assim, foi um processo de imersão profundo naquela cultura pré-islâmica e na língua árabe clássica, né? E isso marcou profundamente a minha vida, né? 10 anos não são um dia, e não são 10 dias, né? E isso marcou profundamente, e eu acho que eu adquiri com isso eu recuperei com isso uma identidade árabe que, de certa maneira, em toda a minha infância, ela foi um pouco negada, né? De ser proibida, né? De certa forma, censurada, né? Pela família por uma série de questões que não sei se vem ao caso comentar.
So he mentions the importance of dictionaries, of course, during this process of learning Arabic, and he relied quite a bit on several dictionaries, but most importantly, there was a famous dictionary, this Arabic Spanish, that's by Federico Corriente, which is a classic dictionary that he used quite a bit. And he also met a professor of Arabic, João Batista Vargas, who encouraged him a lot to learn Arabic. So he began, after completing this course from Cambridge, 45 lessons, in order to continue learning Arabic, he began translating the Mu'allaqa of Imru al-Qais as a linguistic exercise. And as he says, he began kind of verse by verse, working on this translation. And he says it took 10 years to translate all of the mu'allaqats, from 10 years from the time that he began teaching himself Arabic with the help of that Cambridge course until he had completed translating, in fact, more than the mu'allaqats. He translated 11 poems. We know, of course, the mu'allaqats are, by some accounts, 7, by other accounts, 10. So he translated all of the 10, and in addition to another one as well, and published those in a Portuguese version. But 10 years to do so, and he describes the process of translating these poems, that he would begin with each verse, trying to understand not only the language and how each verse is constructed linguistically, but also understanding the imagery. And in the process of doing that, he would also compare all the different translations of the mu'allaqat that he has in the various languages that he reads. And what he discovered is that each translation was somewhat different from the other, and sometimes the differences were great. Of course, those who are familiar with translation understand that no translation is exactly similar to the original. And it's something you discover right away when you begin to compare two different translations of the same text. This is something that I'm adding here. But he says that he, of course, in his comparison of all of these different versions of the mu'allaqat, he realized that they vary quite a bit from one another, and that actually put his mind at ease, because it gave him the kind of the comfort of knowing that that his version of the his translation of the mu'allaqat can also be its own text. So then he concludes by saying that this process of learning Arabic and translating the mu'allaqat had a great impact on him personally, because it helped him not only learn a whole new literature, but also to discover his Arab identity, which had been censored, as he puts it, during his childhood and his youth and so on, because of the way he was brought up. So in doing that, in translating the mu'allaqat, he reacquired his Arab identity in a manner of speaking.
E houve assim um episódio importante, né? Porque eu fui ao Líbano para comprar livros. Né? Eu, por exemplo, não tinha, né? Na internet, na época, pelo menos, não era possível comprar livros em árabe, ou eu não conseguia comprar, não saberia comprar. Então, eu fui ao Líbano em 1997. Foi uma experiência interessante, até porque no voo eu tentei articular algumas palavras em árabe clássico, né? que eu estava aprendendo, e eu pedi água para a aeromoça, e ela não me serviu, não trouxe água, e eu não estava entendendo, até que eu não sabia por quê, porque ela era libanesa, e eu, então, depois falei em inglês, aí ela me trouxe a água em inglês, quando eu pedi em inglês, ela me trouxe. E depois ela falou para mim, você falou comigo de uma forma muito arrogante, porque eu tinha usado, eu acho que no popular, né, no dialeto popular do Líbano, mai, seria água, né? E eu tentei articular ma'un, né? Ma'un, né? No clássico, né? Como eu lia, né? Com Hamza, né? E ela achou aquilo uma maneira arrogante de falar. No Líbano, muitas vezes, para perguntar o nome de uma rua, uma referência que eu tinha, eu escrevia. Então, eu passei a escrever, tinha um caderno, escrevia, para fazer as perguntas, fazia em inglês, mas mostrava a palavra em árabe escrita, porque eu passei a ficar com vergonha até de pronunciar, porque eu percebi que era realmente muito diferente, né? E até as palavras que a minha avó pronunciava, né, em árabe, eu percebi que, vendo essas palavras, a forma escrita delas, via como que era diferente. Mas no Líbano eu comprei muitos livros, né? E livros em inglês também, que aí me deram um conhecimento muito grande da história da Arábia, né, da Península Arábica, dos povos árabes, né, de todo o Oriente Médio. Então, esses livros a gente não tinha acesso no Brasil, eram pouquíssimas traduções de obras assim importantes, ou de história, né? Lá eu tive a oportunidade, inclusive, de comprar livros que discutiam teoricamente, interpretavam as mu'allaqat, né? Então, isso foi muito importante, essa viagem, e também pelo conhecimento que eu tive de um país árabe. Na verdade, eu visitei 3 países. Visitei o Líbano, a Síria e a Jordânia, né? Mas fiquei mais tempo no Líbano e na Síria. A Jordânia foi só um pequeno trecho até voltar. Mas nesses lugares, então, eu tive um contato com esse universo, com o mundo árabe, ainda que contemporâneo, mas vi o deserto pela primeira vez. Então, eu comecei a ter também uma certa capacidade de entender algumas das imagens que eu imaginava que os poemas pudessem tentar traduzir, né, daquela visão, né? Tive a felicidade de encontrar, passeando no deserto sírio, com uma tribo de beduínos, e que estavam realizando um casamento. Então, nós paramos, o guia não queria parar, achando que era perigoso, mas nós insistimos, era uma excursão, né, para que ele parasse. Então, fomos muito bem recebidos no acampamento, dancei junto com os beduínos. Então, foi uma experiência assim, que me deu alguma coisa de um universo perdido, né, muito antigo, mas que eu pude recuperar e que me marcou assim, profundamente. essa viagem, né, feita ao Líbano para comprar livros, né, e comprei até o livro em árabe, né, comprei vários livros em árabe, mas depois eu acabei desistindo de traduzir todos eles, porque o esforço é muito grande. Mas trouxe os exemplares, né, das muálacas em árabe para poder fazer a tradução.
So he tells of his trip to Lebanon, first trip, of course, to the Arab world in 1996, and an interesting anecdote on the plane. He tried to use Arabic, and of course he asked for water, but he pronounced water in classical Arabic, al-ma'u, and the flight attendant didn't understand him. And then he had to ask her again for English, and that's when she brought him brought him water, and then told him that to her the way he pronounced classical Arabic sounded arrogant. Of course, I mean, he wasn't being arrogant. This is how he knew the word for water as he had read it and tried to pronounce it. And then, of course, there's a difference, as we know, between spoken Arabic, the dialect of each country, and the classical language that we read. But in any case, I mean, he went to Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and acquired a great many books about pre-Islamic Arabia, books in history and literature, about the culture in general, many books in Arabic, and also in in English and French. And he brought all of these books with him in order to, of course, read them and understand the context of these poems. And it was also that he was able to see the desert for the first time during that trip, and begin to visualize the environment of these poems. Because, of course, I mean, it's hard to understand these poems if you've never really seen the desert. And at least to just kind of get a sense of what that looks like visually. So he was able to do that.
Bem, e nesse processo de tradução, não era uma tradução profissional, né? Eu estava fazendo essa tradução por vontade própria, por o meu próprio enriquecimento, por uma aventura pessoal. E enquanto eu escrevia meus romances, eu estava começando a minha carreira, né? Eu tinha acabado, nessa época, nem concluído o primeiro livro, 96, 97, então publiquei minha primeira coletânea de contos em 1997, e meu primeiro romance, uma novela, né? Um romance curto, em 1999. Então, eu ainda estava no processo de aprender árabe e traduzir. Só que o envolvimento que eu tive com o universo pré-islâmico, com a língua árabe, com a cultura árabe, na forma como ela me chegava pelos livros, né, e por essa primeira viagem, né, eu não consegui, depois da publicação desse meu primeiro romance, que foi meu segundo livro publicado, chamado O Trono da Rainha Ginga, eu não consegui dar sequência ao projeto de que ele fazia parte. Eu tinha imaginado escrever 5 romances históricos sobre o Rio de Janeiro, um em cada século, né? O Rio é a cidade que tem 5 séculos de existência, então eu iria escrever do século XVI, XVII, XVIII, XIX e início do século XX. Né? Eu fiz o primeiro volume, mas eu estava tão envolvido com o universo árabe, com o universo pré-islâmico, que foi impossível continuar. Então, a minha ficção, quer dizer, todas aqueles estímulos, né, visuais dos poemas, da mitologia, né, e de fragmentos da mitologia, na verdade, né, porque não era uma mitologia escrita, né, no sentido de que a gente tivesse um compêndio completo de como era a mitologia dos povos pré-islâmicos, dos árabes pré-islâmicos. Isso não existe, né? Há fragmentos, há referências muito vagas. E eu, então, comecei a escrever. Escrevi uma novela, se alguém conhece o livro O Enigma de Qaf, ele tem uma história principal que recebe 28 capítulos, né? E que são intercalados por pequenas histórias, contos, né? Que eu chamo uns de excursos e outros de... agora eu esqueci. Excursos e parâmetros, né? Parâmetros. O livro é muito antigo, já esqueci um pouco, né? Mas, então, eu fiz primeiro os 28 capítulos, que seria uma pequena novela, e apresentei para o meu editor em 2001, talvez, mais ou menos, e ele disse, não, olha, está muito pequeno para ser publicado dessa maneira. Assim não vai ser possível. Então, ele recusou a publicação do livro, né? Era uma novela muito pequena, realmente o livro né, ficava um pouco a quantidade de texto. Então, eu tive a ideia então, de inserir essas histórias. Então, como foi fazer isso? Eu, primeiro, peguei os poetas pré-islâmicos, né, conhecidos, historicamente conhecidos, e contei a história deles para ambientar. Mas eu precisava dos textos originais, porque eu estava traduzindo. E eu só tinha, se não me engano, 13 desses poemas, desses poetas antigos, né? Então, eu só conseguia preencher 13 buracos dos 27 que os 28 capítulos tinham, né? Então, se eu tenho 28 capítulos, eu precisava ter 27 historinhas para colocar. Então, recontei, adaptei algumas delas, né? Umas mais, outras menos, para contar a história desses poetas pré-islâmicos, para comparar com o protagonista do meu romance, que era também um poeta pré-islâmico, né? Ficcional. E os outros 14 espaços, eu inventei histórias, inventei mitologia, né, para preencher uma mitologia pré-islâmica que eu não conhecia, mas que eu podia tentar inventar, né, como criação ficcional também. Então, por exemplo, eu contei uma história do Ali Baba, mas completamente diferente da original, né? Contei uma história da Sherazade também de outra forma, né? Completamente diferente da história conhecida da Sherazade. Então, fui criando uma mitologia pré-islâmica, né, utilizando os elementos pré-islâmicos, né, os djinns, etc., né, os poetas, aquela coisa toda do universo, do imaginário que nos chegou para a construção do Enigma de Qaf.
So he explains that he, at the time that he began learning Arabic, he was also starting to write fiction in 1997. You know, that trip to Lebanon was in 1996. In 1997, he published his first short story collection, and then 2 years later, a short novel. And that novel was part of a project in which he intended to write a quintet, 5 novels about the history of Rio de Janeiro, each novel set in a different century. And that first novel that he published in 1999 was part of that series. But he found that he was so overtaken by the universe of pre-Islamic poetry that he couldn't carry on with that project of series of historical novels. So he began instead to write the novel that you know, Enigma de Qaf, or The Riddle of Qaf, which in the Arabic translation is called Lughz al-Qaf. And at the same time that he was translating the poems. So he finished the first version of the novel in 2001, and it consisted only of the principal chapters, the ones that are named after or titled with the letters of the Arabic alphabet. And then he sent that to the publisher, and the publisher said, this doesn't work as a novel, it's too short. So it was rejected. So in order to amplify the book a little bit and make it longer so that it fits within the parameters of a novel that a publisher can publish, he thought of this really ingenious design of inserting 27 intermediary chapters within the main, in between the main chapters. So you have 28 chapters, which contain the main plot. That's the main story of the narrator and the pre-Islamic poet, the fictional pre-Islamic poet. And in between, there are 27 other chapters divided into 2 kinds. One that he calls parameters, and the other one that are called digressions. In the English translation, it's called excursions, but it's a mistranslation of excursus in Portuguese, which really means digressions. So in Arabic, that would be مؤشرات واستطرادات, right? استطرادات بمعنى digressions. Of those 27 intermediary chapters, there were stories of 13 poets. He relied on the biographies of the poets and sort of inserted those in there to kind of place the protagonist within a context. And in the 14 other chapters, he simply invented stories in the spirit of pre-Islamic mythology and of Arab folklore. So, for example, you have a story about Aladdin, but that's not really at all the Aladdin that we know from the Arabian Nights. It's Alberto Musa's own reworking of a story around the fictional character called Aladdin, who travels on the seas and so forth. So that's how he did those 13 and 14 chapters to a total of 27 intermediary chapters that give us the structure of the novel as we know it. So this is the story of the novel and how it came about, of course, in the context of Alberto Musa's career as a writer and as a translator of Arabic. So I'm being told now that I should move on to describing how I came to his work, and so I will do that, and then we can open the floor for discussion.
Yeah. So before you start, Professor, I'd like to thank Alberto Musa for this whole description of your process in translating the Muallaka. That's really important in the Arabic literature, and also I'll ask you later about like the importance of this work translated into Portuguese. But now, Professor Wail, I'd like to thank you for translating Alberto Musa as well. And I want to ask you to talk about like the self-translation, the context of self-translation, and the importance of discussing this topic nowadays.
Okay, so I came to this project. I mean, I'm a professor of comparative literature, and I studied. I mean, I began, of course. I should mention at first that I'm from Egypt, and I've come to this country over 30 years ago to the United States to do my graduate work. But my training before that was in English literature. So my bachelor's degree was in English literature. My first MA was in English and comparative literature from the American University in Cairo. And then when I came here to do a PhD, I continued to work on English and French literatures, and I acquired another MA in French and began to be interested in post-colonial studies, that is to say, the study of the history of European colonialism, particularly in my part of the world, in the Middle East, but also in Africa and in Asia. And it was within that context that at the PhD level, I shifted my emphasis to modern Arabic literature. And I became interested in Tayyib Saleh, who was a very famous author from Sudan, who wrote a famous novel called Mawsim al-Hijra ila al-Shamal, seasonal migration to the north. And it's been translated, by the way, into Portuguese by Professor Safa Joubran at USP, whom many of you know. And there, of course, the emphasis of post-colonial studies is really the relations between formerly colonized cultures or countries and the former colonizers. So what that means in the context of comparative literature is studying modern Arabic literature in relation to English and French. English, of course, language of Great Britain, and French for, of course, the fact that France also colonized Egypt before Britain. So Egypt was a colony of both France and Britain, and France also had its colonies in North Africa, in the Maghreb, and also in Lebanon and Syria. So these were the two most influential languages in the Arab world. And it's as I was growing up, I mean, these were the only languages that you studied beyond Arabic. Very, very few people paid attention even to German, for example, another important European language. And nobody, growing up, nobody that I knew understood or ever learned Spanish or Portuguese or any other language really beyond English, French, and maybe German for some people. So that was the orientation that I brought to the PhD and to my work as a comparatist, and of course, I mean, this is the relationship between the Arab world and Europe. This is what I think about in terms of North-South relationship. There's a certain hierarchy, not only in terms of geography, but also, more importantly, really, in terms of colonial history and the hegemonic languages in the Arab world, which are, English and French, and the dominance, really, the cultural dominance of France and Britain in the Arab world. This was the only conceivable way in which you could, study Arabic literature in a comparative context, only in relation to English and French. And then after that, I began to be interested in Arab immigration to the United States and to Britain, and writers who are writing in English, Mahjar, people in our friends in Palestine will know what that is, Arab al-Mahjar. And it was during that time, I mean, that I was working on Arab al-Mahjar that I came across a book that had been edited by two German scholars who had convened a conference in Germany, to which they invited some Arab writers, including Elias Khouri, of course, who was part of this course, very famous, one of the most important Arab novelists today, and writers not only, from throughout the Americas, not only from the United States, but also from Latin America. And in that book, I first came across Alberto Musa's work because he had participated in that conference and wrote an essay in it about how precisely the story that he told us now. How he grew up and came to the discovery of the Arabic language. So I was really fascinated by that. I was fascinated by the fact that there is a whole literature by Arab immigrants in Latin America about which I knew absolutely nothing. And I got a translation of the Riddle of Qaf, the English translation, and I read that, and that was a revelation because there was nothing like that written in English, or even written in Arabic for that matter. The pre-Islamic period is a subject that has never been treated by Arab novelists. Even the modern period. There are historical novels in Arabic about every single period of Arab history, of Islamic history, except for the pre-Islamic period. So I thought there was something quite unique here. And I was also fascinated by the relationship that Alberto Musa described. And as I began to do more research, also I found between Arab immigrants and their descendants in Brazil especially, and the Arabic language and Arab culture, which was so different from the relationship between that Arab Americans, for example, in the United States felt toward the United States and to the Arab world. And I began to ask myself, how come that even for a discipline that is open to the study of the relations between different literatures, like comparative literature, this is the broadest and the most open-ended literary field, because it allows you to study more than one, the literature of more than one country, the more one language. How come I never came across Latin American literature before, and even Arab writers in Latin America? So So I realized here that the way I was educated and the way comparative literature programs were educated were so Eurocentric in the sense that our relationship, our sense of identity was defined only in relation to Europe or the United States, rather than other parts of the world, even parts of the world with which the Arab world has historically had very strong relations. I mean, as we know, of course, I mean, Latin America was colonized and settled by people from Spain, and in the case of Brazil, from Portugal. And that happened at the end of 8 centuries in which, the Iberian Peninsula was dominated by Arab culture. And Arabs had a tremendous impact on Spain and on Portugal. And so the colonists who settled in Latin America brought that culture with them, these cultural influences. They were folded into their own culture. So that's a very powerful historical connection, really, between the Arab world and Latin America. Not to mention the very large numbers of immigrants from Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, who went to the Americas in the late 19th century. I mean, almost a half of the population of Mount Lebanon, for instance, left for the Americas in the late 19th century. And most of them went to Latin America, and the largest number settled in Brazil. So that's another very powerful connection between the Arab world and Latin America. And yet that was completely absent from the way my discipline really represented literary relations. So that began then to be kind of that became a motive for me, an additional motive. I mean, I was first of all fascinated by Brazil and by Alberto's work and by the Arab presence in Brazil, and that was a motive enough for me to want to learn Portuguese in order to read that literature, just as he had learned Arabic in order to read the Mu'allaqat. But I also was fascinated by the way knowledge systems are created, how academic disciplines are organized, and these larger sort of disciplinary and literary theoretical questions that my discovery, and because it is like a discovery, right? It's a discovery of literary discovery of Brazil, opened up a whole new vista for me as somebody who was interested in comparative literature. So that happened. I read that book in 2007, and that was the first time that I encountered Alberto Mussa's work. And I returned to Brazil in 2009, and by then I had read his novel in English translation, and I called him up and we met. That was the first time that we sit together. And I didn't know any Portuguese at the time, I mean, except for just a few phrases, really, that you couldn't use for conversation. And nevertheless, we were able to have a very long conversation, which was fascinating. So upon my return, I began to learn Portuguese, and I spent about 4 years really learning Portuguese. And I kept going to Brazil to study there, to study the language, and to also do research on the literature. And I began the project of translating the novel is so fascinating. A Brazilian novel set in pre-Islamic Arabia. I thought that is something that had to be translated into Arabic. So I was encouraged by friends in Egypt to do that myself. And I said, well, but I'm still learning the language. I mean, how can I translate a Brazilian novel into English when I'm still learning Portuguese? And they said, well, if you don't do it, no one else will, because there's nobody here who translates from Portuguese. And that was, that was stunning in a sense, because there was a major translation project financed by the government, by the Ministry of Culture. They were publishing over 100 books a year. The vast majority of them are from English and French and German, and some from Russian, and that was about it. Occasionally, you may encounter something from Chinese or what have you, but so that reinforced my sense of kind of the Eurocentric orientation of Arab culture generally, and I began to translate the novel, And I relied to a great extent, of course, on dictionaries, just as Alberto relied on dictionaries, and I also relied on the English translation of the novel. Eventually, I finished the translation in 2012, but because of the uprising in Egypt and the disruption that happened in every sector of life the novel wasn't published until 2015. But it came out eventually under under this title here, Waïl Qaf, which I believe was made available to our friends in Palestine who are following this course. So that's how. So the South-South relationship is precisely that. I mean, it's how can we think about the relationship between, in a comparative context, between Arabic literature and Latin American literature, and specifically in this case, in my case, Brazilian literature. So my translation of Alberto Musa's novel, the purpose of it was to make Arab readers aware of a fascinating novel like this, which deals with Arabic poetry, of course, which is treasured by all Arabs as really the fountainhead of their literature. And to also help shed some light on Brazilian literature in general and foster interest. My hope is that more people would be studying languages like Portuguese and Spanish and looking beyond these conventional colonial relations with only interested in Europe or the United States. There are other parts of the world that are important for us to learn about, and certainly Latin America and Brazil in particular is extremely important. So that's how I began to think about South-South relationship instead of North-South relationships only. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions too. Alberto, you're muted. Não tem som.
Sim, não, agora já ativei. Não, só uma curiosidade que é importante para salientar, né, a qualidade de tradução do Wail. Durante o processo de tradução, ele me consultou em alguns casos, né, sobre algumas dúvidas. E em 3 passagens do texto original em português, eu percebi que a dúvida dele era em função de uma expressão que eu poderia, na verdade, ter escrito melhor. Então, quando o livro, e esse livro foi muito importante na minha vida como escritor, porque foi o livro que me deu uma projeção na literatura brasileira. A partir desse livro, os outros livros que eu tinha publicado, eu não tinha conseguido grandes matérias em jornal, nenhum grande destaque, e esse livro me deu, inclusive, um prêmio internacional do Casa de las Américas, né? Importante, outra premiação também que eu recebi também da Associação Paulista de Críticos de Arte. Então, ele me deu 2 prêmios e ele foi muito bem recebido, né? É hoje ainda o meu livro mais traduzido no exterior, o Enigma de Qaf, e foi ele, então, que me projetou. Mas, então, eu tive uma segunda edição. Nessa segunda edição, eu aperfeiçoei o texto em função das dúvidas do Wail, porque eu poderia ter escrito melhor. Então, assim, a importância e a qualidade da tradução, né, e a relação do autor com um tradutor, ela para mim, por exemplo, tem uma significação muito grande. Eu já tive livros publicados em vários idiomas e alguns deles eu não conheço, não sei quem são os tradutores. Não sei como esse processo de tradução pode ser feito sem um contato como esse que nós tivemos, não só pessoal, muitas vezes esse contato é feito por e-mail, porque não é possível ter outra maneira. Mas eu queria destacar isso, né? Salientar essa qualidade. Então, o livro, a partir de agora, ele foi modificado em função das observações que o Wail fez, as dúvidas, né, a respeito da tradução. E isso daí eu acho que é muito importante e enriquece o livro, né? O leitor enriquece o próprio livro. É o leitor quem faz o livro, na verdade.
So he says that, and of course, this was this has been the novel, his most successful novel. It received 2 very important prizes: one international prize, the Casa de las Americas, which is given in Cuba, and also an important, a very important prize in Brazil, the Association of Critics of Sao Paulo. And it became the novel his novel that's been the most translated. I think it's about 16 or 17 languages, something like that. And it's gotten him a lot of success and a lot of publicity and attention, and established his reputation. But he says that we had a very close contact with him, of course, which is was the case. I had to ask him a lot of questions because I couldn't just rely on my own judgment. I suppose my Portuguese, as I said, was or still under construction, more or less. I was still learning the language, and I couldn't trust the English translation because I realized that there were some problems there. So I asked him. I was in close contact with him during the translation process, and I sent him a lot of questions in order to just kind of make sure that I'm understanding the novel correctly. And then he says that he realized that there were, at least on 3 occasions in the novel, there are places where he could modify certain things to make them clearer. So the novel was published in a second edition in was it, I think, 2013 or 14? A segunda edição foi em 2003?
2012.
2012, okay. So he published the second edition of the novel with some amendments, very, very short, sort of slight amendments. He said that some of them were based on the questions that I had asked him, and he realized that he could clarify certain things. And I can add to that, interestingly, that my translation was published in 2015 after the second edition was published of the novel, but I was translating from the first edition. And even though I was translating from the first edition, I incorporated these changes that he made. So it appears now that the translation was based on the second edition, whereas in fact it was based on the first edition, and I incorporated in it changes that he kind of told me to make, that were later on he included in the second edition. But because the translation was delayed, as I said, by 3 years because of the revolution in Egypt, it actually came out after the second edition. But that's a detail.
So I'd like to thank Alberto Musa and Professor Wail Hassan for this enlightening and inspiring conversation. I mean, I'm particularly thankful for bringing to our attention the significance of literary translation, how literature and translation are intertwined with social political issues. Once literature can be like a space for addressing politics and reflect political position as well. So, obrigado, Musa, por compartilhar a sua experiência de tradução, que é muito enriquecedora para nós tradutores, e eu acho que para as pessoas de outras áreas também, para entender todas os desafios que a tradução impõe a nós. E obrigada ao professor Wail também por trazer esses aspectos sociopolíticos que envolvem o processo de tradução e recepção de literatura. So the first question I have is to Professor Wail Hassan. It is about like the role of post-colonial theory for the readings we have in South literature and North-South literature. How this theory impact or influence the reading we have of these literatures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have to say first that this idea of thinking about these cultural relations in directional terms, in terms of geographical coordinates, north-south or south-south, didn't really occur to me until I had discovered Brazilian literature. So before that time, it was only natural and to think of modern Arabic literature in relation to European literature. So natural, in fact, that I didn't even think of it south-south. The name itself, south, means distinguishing it from something else. Okay, and if you don't have anything to compare with, then basically you're left with the norm. So to me, and I would say this is the case for the entire post-colonial field. The post-colonial scholars don't think necessarily of themselves as kind of being oriented toward Europe. On the contrary, post-colonial studies sees itself as rejecting European hegemony, rejecting European cultural, not only colonial, geopolitical, but also cultural and epistemological domination, and it does that in a way that is always referring to European texts. And the great example I tend to give is that very, very famous novella by Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, which is so central in post-colonial studies because it's taken as a paradigm, right? It's taken as a model for colonial relations. Here you have, Europeans going from the heart of Europe, civilization, right? The novel opens with Marlowe in London, right, talking about how great the the Thames River is, and the glorious history of the British, of the British Empire, and the services that this great river has rendered to it, and then going from there to another river in the heart of Africa, and there having these, just really very unsettling experiences. And the heart of darkness. What is the heart of darkness? Is the heart of Africa in one sense, but it's also the kind of evil that colonialism represents. But there is also a certain stigma that is attached to Africa there, right? Africa is a place of primitives. It's the place of savages. It's the place that is lawless. It's the place where civilized people can lose their bearings, like Kurds, and commit horrible things that would be unthinkable in Europe. So there is that contrast between the North and the South, the civilized, metropolis in Europe, and the uncivilized, the primitive, the darkness that Africa represents. So there's great disdain, great condescension, a great deal of racism also in that colonial outlook. So that's an example, a very paradoxical example for colonial relations. It's a racist criticism of colonialism, as Chinua Achebe called it. Now, how do African writers deal with that, right? Many African writers are constantly writing against Joseph Conrad, and the great, Chinua Achebe's, started out writing, things fall apart in order to show that Africa is not a place of darkness. Africa is a place where there were complex cultures and there were customs and there were, all sorts, there was a whole history, and, and that all of that began to unravel because the Europeans arrived, right? And then someone like Tayyib Saleh, who's interested me a great deal, who writes a novel that is simply the reversal, in many ways of Heart of Darkness. There you have the river. It's the River Nile this time, not the river Congo River, and the succession of Africans, of Sudanese going to Europe instead of a number of Europeans going to Africa as in Heart of Darkness. So you have Mustafa Saeed, and then you have the narrator, and then you have many others going as well. And what does the main character in that novel do? He presents himself as an invader of London, just as the British had invaded the South, right? He says, I am the conqueror who had come to invade you in your own homes. I am a drop of the poison that you have injected into the veins of history, right? So the novel very deliberately reverses the trajectory of Heart of Darkness. It's a direct answer to Heart of Darkness, showing that how Africans too can invade Europe, right? Africans too can look at Europe as a place of darkness and can get there, and you know. So what you have is a kind of a text and a counter text, right? And that's the kind of the post-colonial paradigm. The post-colonial paradigm doesn't accept colonialism as a given. Yes, you are civilized and we are not, please come and help us, right? On the contrary, it's accusatory. You know, you are invaders and we are going to fight you back, and we are going to try and do to you what you have done to us, right? So that's the post-colonial paradigm. But the conversation remains between the two poles, between North and South only, right? The outside world is only Europe, right? That's the limitation that I find in post-colonial studies, is that its point of reference. So if colonial discourse is Eurocentric, post-colonial discourse is also Eurocentric or reverse Eurocentric in that sense. It rejects the hegemony but maintains the kind of that same dialectical relationship, answering back to Europe, not looking elsewhere. You know, and it's because, so I think ultimately it's because of my training as a post-colonialist, because I've spent so many years really working in the post-colonial field, that I was eventually able, once I had that other vista, once I had that opening onto another world, through, of course, first the work of Alberto Musa, and through him, of course, discovering, you know, Brazilian literature and began to study that, then I realized, well, the conversation doesn't just have to be with Europe. I mean, that's, you know, and that was the great breakthrough for me. I mean, it was a completely new direction and way of thinking that was made possible by the fact that I had spent so much time working in post-colonial studies, right? Hence the significance of the revelation, that one can actually look sideways. What about different parts of the South? And incidentally, of course, I mean, in the sphere of politics and in geopolitics, there were these attempts. I mean, in the 1950s, there's the non-allied movement, you know, that came out of the Bandung Conference. I mean, the group of countries, recently independent countries like India and Egypt and many African countries and so on, deciding, well, you know, we don't want to be with the Western camp, nor do we want to be with the Eastern camp. We'll forge our own path. We'll look to our own interests. We'll try and, you know, establish relations with other countries like us. So that was important. And of course, a few years later, with the tricontinental movement, Latin America was added too. I mean, there's the tricontinental movement that was launched in Havana, in Cuba, that included, of course, Latin America within this sort of, you know, what was called at the time the Third World, right? Yeah. After the end of the First World, of course, being the Western Bloc, the Second World, the Eastern Bloc, and the Third World was the rest of the world, really. After the end of the Cold War, that became called the Global South. So the Global South, it's the relations within the Global South, right? Or, you know, as I like to think about it, South-South relations in terms of literary studies. So it's something that has that has a history. In comparative literature, it's new, but it has a history in geopolitics and in cultural studies more generally. And also, I mean, you know, theoretically, precursors, people like Aimé Césaire, for example, in Martinique, from Frantz Fanon, also, who, is a French Martinican who went to Algeria and was a central figure in the Algerian War of Independence and wrote very important books. I mean, he too was talking about relations. He was addressing anti-colonial revolutionaries everywhere, not just in Algeria. So there's a history to this that is simply hasn't been included in literary studies, and that's what I like to kind of focus on.
Yeah, Professor, thank you for your answer. And I have like another question. You mentioned that there's a changing of the direction of the speech in literature. So we have like this north-south dialogue, and now we are kind of moving the direction south-south. This movement is manifest already in the literature. We can see like this dialogue as we see in the past novels considered like post-colonial. Can we see this movement in the narratives nowadays, for example?
In the literature, yes, it's a very small portion, I have to say. I mean, one aspect of it is the literature of Arab immigrants in Latin America. I mean, I've spent the past 12 years or so working on Arab immigrants in Brazil and the representation of Arabs in Brazilian literature. I hope the book will be published later this year. But this is one way of looking at these relations. What have Arab immigrants? What has I mean, there's a whole chapter on Alberto Musa, for example. I mean, as a kind of an author, a Brazilian author of Arab descent who rediscovers his roots through the literature and translates it and writes about it and so on. And I think he has done more than any other writers. I mean, he's mentioned, Milton Hatoum and Radwan Nassar and so forth, who have written about growing up in Brazil, being people of Arab descent. And there are others. So the angle, immigration is one angle for doing this kind of work, but there are other angles as well. I mean, there are, for example, to think about how Arabic literature gets translated in Brazil and how Brazilian literature is translated into Arabic. This is something that's very important, and we have in this course, of course, very distinguished translators in both directions, of Arabic literature into Portuguese and Portuguese literature into Arabic. So there are these kinds of relations. This is how do these literatures get read? How are they received by critics and by readers? To give you an example, I mean, Jorge Amado, who has written, close to 40 or so novels, 22 novels of those, at least, by my count, have been translated into Arabic. Yeah. Okay, and this is something going back several decades. So there has been an awareness, and not just Jorge Amado. And perhaps Jorge Amado is being the most prominent Brazilian author of the 20th century, and one of the most translated abroad. Is a good example. So there is. Why were these novels translated? Under what conditions? Who read them? Who published them? I mean, that's a whole topic for research. Mm-hmm. And of course, there is a translation of Arabic literature in Brazil. I mean, we have the Mu'allaqat here. We're talking to the translator of those, and Safa Gibran has also done a lot, and many others are now translating works of Arabic literature. But even going back, I mean, works like The 1001 Nights, for instance. This is a work that's been known, of course, for a very, very long time, in Brazil, through its translations, through its French and Spanish and English translations and so on. Nevertheless, it's made an impact on writers in Brazil, just as it's made impact on writers, in many parts of the world. So that's another way of looking at South-South relations. I mean, the impact of a work like 1001 Nights on Brazilian writers. So that would be another angle. But there are also other kinds of literary studies that don't necessarily look at direct relations between literatures. This term for that is non-contact comparison without direct contact. How do writers in different parts of the world address similar issues? How do writers in different parts of the world address, for example, the environmental crisis? Right. And that, I mean, if you ask questions like that, then you can look at authors from any number of places and see how how they treat that topic, right? So there are multiple ways of doing it. I mean, the way I have done it is just one angle, but the idea of self relations is really opens up a whole array of possibilities.
Thank you, Professor Hassan. So, Alberto Mussa, eu tenho uma pergunta para você, é do Ricardo Hirata. Ele pergunta por que o árabe era uma língua proibida na sua família, porque não se falava árabe na sua família. E por que os seus antepassados vieram para o Brasil? So the question I asked to Alberto Mussa was like, why was the Arabic language forbidden to speak in your family? And why did your ancestors come to Brazil? It was like asked by Ricardo Hirata.
Bem, vou responder pela última, né? Começando pela última. Eles vieram porque é uma história interessante, porque a família da minha avó, da minha avó paterna, né? Era de Almina, né? Em Trípoli, Trablus, né? Do Líbano. E eles... esse casal, né? Aliás, minha avó é de lá, né? Meus bisavós, da família Shakur, era lá de Trablus. O meu bisavô faleceu, né? Ele faleceu, eles tinham 9 filhos, todos ainda muito jovens, só o mais velho, que já tinha vindo ao Brasil. Já tinha vindo ao Brasil, segundo a lenda familiar, para fugir da convocação pelo exército turco, né? Então, na época, né, o que existia era o Império Otomano, e então ele teria vindo para cá. No momento em que essa minha bisavó Malak ficou viúva, então ela entrou em contato havia parentes já aqui, né, no Brasil, de outros ramos, entrou em contato e veio com os 9 filhos. A minha avó é uma das mais velhas, ela já era uma moça, né, ela tinha 20 anos, exatamente. E só que o meu avô da família Mussa, né, Najib Daoud Mussa, meu avô, ele tinha a condição financeira superior à da família da minha avó. Eles trabalhavam com queijo, vendiam, faziam chancliche, faziam produtos de queijo de cabra. E com o falecimento desse meu bisavô, as coisas ficaram muito ruins, então por isso eles resolveram emigrar. O meu avô era apaixonado pela minha avó. Eles eram namorados, eles moravam no mesmo bairro, em Almina, né? E ele tinha um futuro, digamos assim, que meu avô era professor. Eu tive lá, nesse lugar, era uma escola, um colégio, associado à igreja de Marilias em Trablus, né? E o meu bisavô, pai do meu avô Najib, meu avô Daoud Mussa, ele era diretor de lá. E o meu avô estava sendo preparado para substituir, né, para suceder o pai, né? Meu avô também falava muitas línguas, conhecia as línguas neolatinas, falava italiano, francês, inglês, alemão, além de grego, né? Eles eram greco-ortodoxos, né? Rumi, né? Como se diz em árabe, né? De uma família cristã ortodoxa grega. E aí eles, então, esse meu avô era apaixonado pela minha avó, e ele desistiu de tudo, ele abandonou tudo e ele se casou com ela em abril de 1920, aliás, em abril de 1920, ele se casou, pediu permissão, a mãe mala, que, né, minha bisavó, se casaram, e ele veio ao Brasil, acompanhando a minha avó. Chegaram aqui no Brasil no dia 6 de junho de 1920, vindo num navio italiano chamado Príncipe de Udine. Então, chegaram aqui, ele veio, né, veio casado, casou 2 meses antes da viagem, pela paixão pela minha avó. E a minha avó veio para cá porque a mãe decidiu, em função da situação financeira que a família ficou após o falecimento do meu bisavô. E aqui, então, eles, né, começaram a vida de como todo imigrante, né, trabalhando no comércio, aquela coisa toda. E assim foi. Agora, a proibição da língua, eu tenho a impressão, há várias versões, né, para isso. Aqui eu me lembro, né, quando eu era criança, é que o meu pai dizia que o meu pai não tinha nenhuma relação com o universo árabe, ele tinha um bloqueio completo, né? Então, inclusive, ele tinha uma coisa muito interessante, porque ele dizia assim, não, que eu não sou árabe, eu sou fenício. Ele dizia isso, né? Porque não era um árabe muçulmano, ele era cristão, então ele dizia que era fenício. Era uma coisa muito engraçada, e eu sempre achei isso uma coisa muito estranha, né? Pertencer a um povo que não existe, né? Então, ele dizia que o árabe, se eu falasse árabe, porque quando eu era criança, parece que eu era bem pequeno, meus avós falavam em árabe, e eu comecei a compreender, como toda criança, aprende uma língua com muita facilidade, e eu comecei a interagir com meus avós. Mas o meu pai proibia, porque dizia que se eu aprendesse árabe, eu falaria muito mal o português. Então, era um preconceito dele, uma visão errada, até do ponto de vista científico. A gente sabe que uma criança pode aprender várias línguas muito bem ao mesmo tempo, desde que expostas a essas línguas, né? Então, eu tive essa oportunidade e me foi proibido esse aprendizado, me foi proibido. Mas o meu pai falava isso. Agora, há também outros relatos dizendo que, naquela época, em 1920, havia um preconceito muito grande contra a imigração árabe. Então, apesar do Brasil ser, em tese, um país que recebeu muitos imigrantes, mas os imigrantes bem-vindos eram os imigrantes europeus, alemães, italianos, espanhóis, portugueses, né? Esses eram mais bem-vindos que os imigrantes árabes, que os imigrantes do Oriente Médio, os judeus e árabes, muitos judeus do Marrocos, muitos árabes do Oriente Médio, que vieram para cá, não tinham a mesma recepção aqui. Então, meu pai, teria sofrido também muitos problemas na escola, junto com outros tios, porque eles eram ofendidos, né? Eles eram tratados de uma forma agressiva, né? Ou sofriam o chamado, hoje em dia, o termo conhecido como bullying, né? Eles sofriam esse tipo de agressão em função da ascendência árabe, né? Eu não senti isso na minha juventude, essas coisas já tinham desaparecido, mas que parece que no início do século era ainda uma resistência era muito grande. Mas logo depois, como esses árabes também enriqueceram, né, muitos deles, e logo as primeiras gerações elas já começaram a ocupar, né, uma situação social e econômica favorável, né? Meu pai era juiz de direito, né? Duas tias minhas eram formadas em química, a outra geóloga, então, assim, outra professora de matemática, então todos ascenderam, digamos assim, culturalmente e economicamente com uma certa rapidez. Então, talvez esse preconceito na minha época, na minha geração, tenha se diluído, né, tenha ficado adormecido em função dessa ascensão social, mas na época deles não. Então, essas são as explicações por que o árabe, né, para não marcar uma identidade árabe, porque ela era mal vista, e pela suposição do meu pai, uma suposição maluca, aí, meio absurda, de que se eu aprendesse árabe, então eu não falaria bem o português.
Obrigada, Musa. Obrigada. Professor Hassan, I have another question for you. and it's about like the translation, because Musa was telling us that he had problems when using Arabic Fusha when he was asking for water. So, and we know that there are like many dialects of Arabic. So the book you translated from Portuguese was translated into one of these dialects, or it was like translated into Fusha. And if it was like used any dialect, how is the chosen of the dialect for the translation? It was asked by Rafael.
Right. Well, no, it was translated into Fusha, of course. And I mean, first of all, the dialects are not really written. I mean, there are attempts by some writers to write works in the dialect, but these tend to be these are very small experiments, and they tend not to have wide circulation. There, I mean, Arabic, of course, as you know, has multiple registers, and there's the spoken of various countries, and some countries have even more than one dialect, regional dialects. I mean, Egypt has, multiple regional dialects. I mean, there's the Arabic spoken in Cairo, there's the Arabic spoken in Alexandria, there is the Arabic of the Bedouins of Sinai, there is, in the Nile Delta region, every region has its own dialects, and in the south there are more than one dialect as well. But the one language that everybody understands across the entire Arab world, the language of is the classical language, right? So that's the Fusha, right? That's the language of education. That's the language of writing. It's the language of the news that you hear on television, on the radio, so even within the Fusha, there are several registers. The most elevated, of course, is the style of the mu'allaqat, of pre-Islamic and of classical Arabic literature generally, and of course, the Quran, right, and the religious tradition. Below that, there are other levels of Fusha. There is what they call modern standard Arabic. This is the language that you hear on television, on the news. There's the language of many journalists, for instance, who write for newspapers, for magazines, that sort of thing. So because of the subject matter of this novel, which is pre-Islamic poetry, and because the main character is supposedly a fictional character, but is a pre-Islamic poet, I tried to translate the novel in as high a register of Fusha as I could manage. Okay, so I translated this in as classic a language as I could manage, and of course, I mean, there are, I hope that there will be a second edition of the Arabic version in which I will also make some corrections, because I realize that there are places where I could have said things better in better Arabic. So just as Alberto kind of made some corrections in the second edition of the novel, and I also have some corrections to make in what I hope will be a second edition of the novel. But to answer the question, yes, I mean, this was translated in classical Arabic, and there's something really interesting here too. I mean, in the original novel, there are many passages from pre-Islamic poetry that are quoted. So in a lot of these chapters, about the 13 chapters about the various pre-Islamic poets, there are quotations from their poems, right, in Portuguese translation. So what the English translator did, the English translator didn't know Arabic. The English translator, and I, imagine this happened also in other translations, the translator translated the Portuguese into English, right? But translating it into Arabic, of course, I had the privilege of being able to quote directly from the original poems, right? So I didn't translate these verses. I just went to the mu'allaqat themselves, and I quoted from them. So what you have here is a really interesting kind of case in which suppose the original, quite, and I'm putting original between quotation marks here, the original Portuguese novel contains translations of the poetry, but the Arabic translation of the novel contains the original poetic passages, you see? So here you have two texts, one original, one translation, that are kind of almost sort of interconnected in that way. And I tend to think of the yin-yang, you know, the yin-yang symbol, which the white part has a black dot and the black part has a white dot, in the sense that there's a nucleus of each part within the other. And the relationship between these two novels is similar in that the original has translated poetry, the translation has the original poetry in that sense. But of course, so the register of the rest of the narration had to be at the same level. Obviously, I cannot write the same Arabic that pre-Islamic poets would have spoken, but I tried to make it as classical sounding as possible.
Yeah. So as we are talking about like dialect, and as a translator from Arabic into Portuguese, we face a lot of issues when we are translating dialect from any dialect from Egyptian or Lebanese into Portuguese. So I'd like to ask you, Professor, what are like the politics and representation of this group of people that speak this dialect in literature? How can you see like the politics of representation?
Right. Now, it's often the case in modern Arabic fiction that authors will use Fusha for narration and then the dialect for dialogue. Okay. There are authors who use Fusha for everything, including dialogue. I mean, some very great writers, including Naguib Mahfouz, for instance, who will never write in the dialect. I mean, that he considered dialect to be a disease. So even the dialogue in his novels is standardized and made into Fusha. But then there are many other writers. I mean, Tayyib Saleh does that. Ilyas Khouri does that. Many other writers who will insert the dialogue in the dialect. And by doing that, of course, they're able to show various nuances. I mean, sometimes you may have characters from different social strata, something that comes through in the way they speak. You're able to convey that if you're using the dialect for dialogue, but you can't really do it, or you can do it to a lesser extent if Fusha. The question is now, of course, when you translate, how do you do that, right? I personally, I mean, there are different approaches, and different translators use different strategies. There are some translators who like to think of equivalent dialect. For instance, some people may use Black English, for instance, right, or Southern English to convey that. Now, I mean that can produce interesting results, but oftentimes for readers who are not aware, I mean, if they're reading a foreign text and in English translation, a move like that may confuse things, right? So my sense is, I mean, I would just, acknowledge the fact. I like to acknowledge the fact that it's impossible to translate 100% with 100% accuracy, that there are certain things are simply not translatable. So I'd like to focus on what is translatable. How can one compensate, right, for the loss of nuance in other ways, right? So I personally, I prefer not to try and find a different dialect in order to insert within a dialogue. I try to translate, I think, everything into what would be kind of normal language, and just try and make that as accurate and as close to the original as possible, knowing, of course, and alerting the readers also that there are certain things are lost.
Yeah. So still in the politics field of translation, I have like a question from Andrea da Costa Braga. She asks, could you comment, Professor Hassan, on the impact of the decolonial studies on translation praxis, and how do you see potential changes in this career?
Yeah. Post-colonial studies has certainly had a great impact on translation studies, and translation studies is, at least, here in the United States and in Britain, has enjoyed a kind of a revival since the 1990s, and also in France, frankly, since the 1980s. In the sense that there's been greater attention to translation as a medium, and the question of power relations, of course, which is central to post-colonial studies, begins to be sort of detected in the process of translation. Who is translating who? How are they doing so? And to what effect?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the most important question, I would say, or the series of questions that post-colonial translation theory is involved with. How are European authors, for example, translating Arabic or Indian texts? We know that there was a major translation of so-called Oriental texts, starting in Europe, in Germany, in France, in England, particularly from the late 18th century, which is the moment in which Oriental studies emerges in European universities, really. Many of these translations were good. They introduced, Asian literatures to Europe. But also, along with that came a lot of stereotypes. Stereotypes that were enforced in the process of translation. And, take The 1001 Nights again. That's a great example, right? It was, the work was translated multiple times in the 18th and 19th centuries into English and French. And each one of the major translations, is completely different from the others, right? Whether you go with, like the sort of the Antoine Galland, for instance, which contains so much. Galland rewrote major parts of the work. All the famous stories from the 1001 Nights, the stories of Aladdin, the stories of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, all of these things were not in the original manuscripts of the 1001 Nights. Yeah? Somebody told them to Galland orally, and he sat down and wrote them, right? And wrote them, of course, in the manner of Oriental tales. Oriental tales is kind of a genre, right? Europeans writing tales that are supposedly by Oriental writers, that are full, of course, of misconceptions and stereotypes and kind of reductive ideas about how Indians or Chinese or Arabs think, and all of that is conveyed in a translation of a work like The 1001 Nights, and that then gives a lot of readers their first ideas about, say, Arabs. So these works, the study of the power dynamics here, the study of the ways in which translation can produce stereotypes, or alternatively can undermine stereotypes. That's really the kind of the impact of post-colonial studies on translation theory. And the way translation theory has developed, as I said, in the past 20 to 30 years, has been very much informed by these kinds of perspectives.
Yeah. So still in the field of post-colonial studies, we see like the North, they have like a particular interest in Arabic literature, depending on historical or political episodes, right? We see like when things get a little bit more complicated in Middle East, people start like reading and translating in the North from Arabic into English and into French. Do you think there is like this kind of interest between South and South? And I'm gonna get like part of Bianca Sotero questions that is how can we invite new readers to get to know Arabic through literature and thus demystify, I mean, this culture?
Right. Well, I mean, I think, I think there is more, it seems to me there's more translation now into Portuguese, thanks to the efforts of, all the, wonderful translators that are working hard to bring works of Arabic literature into Portuguese. There is also greater interest, I would say, in the Arab world, in Brazilian literature, not nearly as much as I would like to see. I mean, this is something that is still developing, and I think overall the orientation of the culture in general, I would say in the Arab world, and I would probably think it's not different in Brazil, is still toward the North, is still toward Europe and the United States. This is where most people think. This is where most people think when they think of the outside world. That's where people look for models, for inspiration, for markets for translation, and so on. But I mean, I'd like to think that that the interest in South-South relations is growing. It is tiny. It is still really, really very small, but it is something that needs cultivation, and it needs a lot of dedication and hard work. So it's I hope it has a brighter future.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Hassan. And my last question is for Alberto Mussa. Minha última pergunta é para Alberto Mussa. Alberto, você poderia compartilhar com a gente as dificuldades que você enfrentou na tradução das mu'allaqat e a importância desse trabalho no sistema literário de língua portuguesa traduzido ao sistema literário do sistema de literatura traduzida ao português, desculpa.
Bem, assim, as dificuldades, eu não vou me lembrar de casos, né? Porque já tem muito tempo, né? Então não vou me lembrar de casos específicos. Mas existem duas ordens, né? Eu acho que eu enfrentei duas ordens de dificuldades bem características. Uma delas é a incompreensão de um verso, né? A dificuldade de compreender, porque muitas vezes, mesmo o dicionário do professor Corriente, que é excelente, às vezes o sentido preciso, ou os diversos sentidos, acepções da palavra, para quem não sabe, o dicionário do professor Corriente, ele é organizado pela ordem alfabética de raízes. Então, isso para mim, é muito importante. Isso foi muito importante para mim, porque através da raiz, eu justamente com a compreensão de como funciona o sistema morfológico da língua, então muitas vezes eu conseguia captar o sentido através desse pertencimento da palavra raiz. Então eu passei a ter um olhar também assim muito treinado para olhar para uma palavra em árabe e identificar qual a raiz, né? Triliteral dela ou, eventualmente, quadriliteral, que são mais raras, né? Mas, então, havia incompreensão. E aí eu ia me socorrer, normalmente, com as traduções. Eu ia para o inglês, para o francês, espanhol, né? As traduções que eu tinha. A tradução espanhola do professor Corriente, inclusive. E aí que acontecia a grande maioria das surpresas, é porque as traduções eram muito divergentes. Então, eu comecei a perceber, e aí, bom, aí sim, a minha edição em árabe, eu não me lembro mais a editora, mas eu acho que era... eu tenho ela aqui, mas eu não vou sair daqui agora para localizar onde está. Mas a tradução, a minha edição em árabe, ela, como acho que todas as traduções em árabe, com todas as edições em árabe, ela é cheia de notas, né? Praticamente todo verso tem uma nota explicativa. Então, às vezes, ali vinha alguma definição ou apontava alguma dificuldade, né? ou porque havia versões diferentes, eles optam por um ou outro, então isso me serviu, mas em algumas vezes essas traduções eram muito, muito difíceis. Então, basicamente, eu seguia, nesses casos, a que eu achava mais coerente, seguia um pouco a minha intuição, mas sempre respeitando esse princípio da coerência, da verossimilhança do sentido da palavra traduzida com o sentido da raiz árabe, da origem da raiz, porque me parecia que esse princípio era o mais seguro que eu poderia adotar. Então, essa era a primeira dificuldade. Agora, se a minha tradução está correta, se não está, eu acho até que é provável que é mais uma das possibilidades de tradução. Né? A tradução, até eu acho que de um texto como esse, ele nunca pode ser tão preciso assim, né? Porque as palavras não tinham esse registro na época. Né? A tradução desse vocabulário árabe pré-islâmico, né? De uma poesia que já começou a ser transcrita, ou a ser passada para o papel, mais de 100 anos depois da composição, da época em que foi recitada, ela já traz esses problemas. Então, essa é a primeira ordem das dificuldades. A segunda é muito mais complicada, que é a compreensão exata da imagem. Às vezes, você pega um verso, você entende sintaticamente o que ele quer dizer. Está claro, né? Tudo é coerente, o sentido. Mas qual é a imagem que aquele poeta quer transmitir com aquele verso? Então, isso é que era um grande desafio para mim, de tentar me transportar para o universo pré-islâmico. Por exemplo, então eu estou lembrando aqui vagamente de uma comparação que eu me deparei, que era com a avestruz.
Uhum.
Né? Então, uma comparação qualquer de um cavalo com uma avestruz. E aí eu consegui perceber, através desse jogo, dessa tentativa, de que o poeta, naquele momento ali, a visão que ele estava tendo do cavalo, se não me engano, ou do camelo, agora não me lembro precisamente, mas a comparação com a avestruz era uma imagem que ele estava vendo por trás, quer dizer, o cavalo ou o camelo estavam de costas para ele. Então, ele comparou com o perfil, quer dizer, há uma visão à distância em que ele observa um animal e que o formato que dá a impressão de que seria uma avestruz. Então, assim, esse trabalho, quer dizer, apesar de estar claro o verso, mas um trabalho de tentar visualizar qual é a imagem, qual é a metáfora, né, que está sendo usada. Esse daí que, para mim, que seria, digamos assim, se eu alcançasse essa compreensão, é que eu estaria num grau mais alto de capacidade de tradução, que era captar a imagem real. E aí eu tive que fazer, só para terminar, eu tive que fazer uma opção, que é traduzir literalmente o verso em prosa e não tentar captar o ritmo, como muitos poetas, né, como muitos tradutores tentam fazer, captar o ritmo do original. Primeiro, porque me faltava o talento poético natural, eu não sou poeta, né, sou prosador. Mas porque também você transferir uma imagem, né, metafórica de uma língua tão diferente da língua portuguesa, né, ou da língua brasileira, fazer essa transferência e ainda respeitar o ritmo é praticamente impossível. Então, por isso eu fiz
mergulho, né?
Então, eu fiz a opção da tradução em prosa. Apesar de ser poesia, os versos foram traduzidos em prosa. Eu não sei se eu vou conseguir passar essa resposta para o inglês, se você puder me ajudar.
Ok. Obrigada, professor. Obrigada, Alberto.
Obrigado.
One last question for Hassan, and it was asked by Safa Jubran. Professor, when are you coming to Brazil?
Well, I'm hoping to come in June, yeah.
Okay. You're going to stay long or just like a short visit?
Well, maybe 3 weeks, perhaps a little longer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to invite back Professor Arlene Clamesha. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Janima, for mediating this Q&A. I'd really like to thank those involved in this class. Professor João Batista Vargens. The chat has been very interesting that I've had the chance to follow today. Professor Safa has been very enthusiastically participating here. And so I'm also very pleased to be able to see how, the whole work that the Arabic language, literature, and culture course has been doing here is expressed in everything that has been discussed. And it's been a pleasure. Whoops. There. It's been a pleasure to listen to both Berto's personal account and family stories and methods he used for translation and reflections on how he came to translate and write and to, in practice, make South-South translation work. Putting in practice all this, in motion. And Professor Waïl, it has been a huge revelation for me to listen to your point of view. Really, really very thankful for it, especially for showing us how timid but how strong this transferring from the colonialist, decolonialist, north-south perspective to the transversal south-south perspective is taking on. In movies we can see the same thing. I have several movies that come to mind when you talk about a movie that addresses the colonial and a colonial answering back, and then the movies that start to directly do the transference. And so you brought all this very enriching point of view. Without any more, I would really like to thank everyone here. Thank people who watched the class, have been very enthusiastically commenting and putting their questions. Mais uma vez, Beto, é uma pena que a gente tenha que falar inglês, mas ao mesmo tempo isso vai permitir que isso fique como um material e que vá para mais pessoas no mundo árabe, porque a gente ainda não consegue prescindir dessa língua para fazer, às vezes, a mediação, e a gente sabe como isso é problemático também. Eu lamento, Berta, que a sua última resposta ficou sem tradução, mas a gente vai tratar de dar um jeito nisso na legendagem, tá bom? Para traduzir o que você falou, a gente vai fazer um esforço para isso, para que fique em inglês também, e ninguém no mundo árabe perca nenhuma parte do que foi dito. So, yeah, thank you very much to everyone. Hope to see you soon in Brazil.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Shukran lakum jamia.